And again, we're sexualizing the ice.
It's unavoidable. You know, we always get back to sexualizing inanimate objects.
Hey guys, I'm Brad Polumbo.
And I'm Colin Wright.
And welcome to the fourth episode of our new podcast, Citation Needed, where we are taking on the insane world of woke academia and lifting the lid and shining a light on the absurd research that's getting passed off and somehow approved through this deeply broken system. Laughing and trying not to cry at the same time, Colin. We got some doozies up today. All right, so up first, we've got a famous, or I guess I should say, infamous paper about feminist ice or something. So the paper is titled Glaciers, Gender, and Science, a feminist glaciology framework for global environmental change research. Colin, where do we even start with this one?
Well, this is a paper that kind of started it for me. So it really has kind of like this special place, honestly, in my heart, in the history of me eventually moving from someone nobody knew about who was just sort of in academia being a normal scientist to being a public figure and speaking out against this stuff. So I was still in graduate school at UC Santa Barbara when this paper, the famous feminist glaciology paper, came out in 2016. I had been aware things were like weird in academia and that like odd papers were coming out. This is when like Nature had their sex redefined paper and, you know, calling it a spectrum. So I was getting increasingly concerned about the direction that academia and science was going. And then this feminist glaciology paper just dropped out of thin air. And I think it's just for me and a bunch of other people, this really just solidified this notion that some areas of academia at least have just really truly gone off the rails. So this paper was 2 years before that. Do you remember the grievance studies affair with like James Lindsay and Pluckrose and Boghossian? So just for the viewers, they managed to hoax a bunch of sort of these woke journals, the kind of journals we're looking at here, by publishing insane papers. Like one was titled Human Reactions to Rape Culture and Queer Performativity at the Dog Park.
I remember that one.
You know, they were even awarded like a award for outstanding scholarship for this stuff. So it was really nuts. And this paper was just kind of similar to that.
Yeah, I remember that whole thing that they did. It was really revealing and fascinating at the time. And we might need a 2.0. We might need to have somebody do it again. But onto this infamous paper, right? Who are the authors here? Are they like normal people or are they kind of crazy woke academics?
Yeah, so the paper it's got several co-authors on it. They were all, at the time, they were at the University of Oregon. So the first author, his name is Mark Carey. He's a professor of environmental studies and geography and the director of the Glacier Lab, again, at the University of Oregon. His bio, honestly, it appears pretty normal looking at his Google Scholar. His papers seem normal. There's sort of a hint of progressive ideology, I guess you could say, looking at some of them because they might focus on things like inequalities of ice loss. But otherwise, things look pretty good.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. That kind of keeps me up at night. You know, how ice is contributing to inequality.
Yeah. I mean,
anyway, though, who else is involved in this paper that's become so infamous?
So the second author is Dr. M. Jackson. This is a woman. Again, she does appear pretty normal. So she's now kind of an author of several books that blend fiction and glaciology, which could be interesting. I've never read any of her books, but she's also a speaker, National Geographic Explorer, and she's a TED Talk fellow. TED's gone a little woke here and there, so I haven't actually had the chance to look at her whole talk yet. But she didn't stay in science once she got her PhD, so she just kind of left to be, you know, more of a public author figure. The third author, Alessandro Antonello, I think is how you say his name. He's at the University of Tasmania. His research seems a bit more off. You know, it's focused on words. So there's these buzzwords like post-humanities and post-human thought. To
red flags.
Yeah. You know, he's all about like decolonizing the relationships between human and non-human. So yes, very, very much red flags. We've seen this language, I think, most predominantly in the brine shrimp paper. And the last author, Jacqueline Rushing, she works at the USDA Forest Service. And looking at her research, it looks pretty normal, which is, I guess, a good thing because she works for the government here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want my tax dollars going to publish insane woke research, so that's a relief. Where was this paper published before it made such a splash?
So it's published in a real academic journal. I believe it's published by the Wiley Publishing, which is widely regarded. It's in the journal specifically is called Progress in Human Geography.
Yes, an entry into feminist glaciology, making huge progress in our understanding of geography. But let's get into the vocab for this paper because I imagine there's some scientific language and maybe some woke language as well that we'll need to understand to work our way through this one.
There will be some as we go through it. So as we've seen many of the activist terms in the previous papers, we've covered like things like colonialism and feminism and ways of knowing. We've gone over those in more detail in previous episodes, so it's maybe best not to dwell on those too much and go into too much detail. But we'll kind of mention them as they come up as a refresher. I think it might be good to define glaciology off the bat, just so our audience knows what that is, or at least really what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, so according to Grok, glaciology is the scientific study of glaciers, ice sheets, and other ice forms, including their formation, movement, and effects on the environment. It examines ice properties, behavior, and interactions with climate, geology, and hydrology. So that sounds like normal science to me. I'm very curious to see how feminism will come into it, though.
Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward scientific field that is studying glaciers and everything they affect or affects them. Nothing to criticize about glaciology as a field of science.
So, how about the paper itself? Like, what was the objective or the thesis? Where do we begin with this one?
This is always where things get weird. So from the abstract, the paper claims to focus on glaciers because they are key icons of climate change and global environmental change.
I mean, that sounds semi normal to me. Like, so far, so good ish.
So good-ish. But then they claim that, quote, the relationships among gender, science, and glaciers, particularly related to epistemological questions about the production of glacial knowledge, remain understudied. So when I was in graduate school, my mentors, they instilled upon me this idea that you should never really justify your research simply by claiming that something is understudied, because there's often a very good reason why things might be understudied in science. Maybe it's just not a very interesting or important question. So you should always try to make a positive argument, I think, for why you're doing something, not just like no one's ever looked at the intersection of feminism and glaciers and human ice interactions, this type of stuff.
You know, that's actually a good point. I hadn't thought of that, but simply something being understudied, well, maybe it's understudied for a reason. Maybe it's not actually interesting or worthy of study. But what do I know? I'm not an expert in feminist glaciology.
Nor am I. So, if you understand your field well enough, it shouldn't be hard to actually identify the important problems to make a positive case for studying them.
Well, maybe they did that in this paper. Give them the benefit of the doubt, though I have my sneaking suspicions. Let's get into the specifics now, Colin.
Yeah, so the paper claims to focus on these four main themes of what they call, and I think they introduced this here as this novel concept, the quote, a feminist glaciology framework. So
Oh,
this comes in four parts. Get ready. So one is on what they call knowledge producers. Then there's gendered science and knowledge. Then they have systems of scientific domination, and then alternative representations of glaciers. So the authors claim that this feminist glaciology framework merges, quote, feminist post-colonial science studies and feminist political ecology, and that it, quote, generates robust analysis of gender, power, and epistemologies in dynamic social ecological systems, thereby leading to more just and equitable science and human ice interactions.
what is a human ice interaction, or do I even want to know?
I think I had one with my refrigerator today, but I'm not sure if that qualifies.
But was it a just interaction, Colin? Was it an
I didn't ask.
equitable human
The,
ice
the
interaction?
refrigerator did not consent for me extracting ice from it. This is a long paper. This is something that we could probably talk about for hours, but who's going to want to hear that? So we should probably just briefly touch on the four aspects of the feminist glaciology framework to see maybe what the authors are getting at and if there's anything there.
All right, so where do we start?
Maybe with this part here. Could you read this for us, Brad?
Yeah, so the feminist glaciology approach claims to argue for, quote, the integration of alternative ways of knowing beyond diverse women's knowledges to include, more broadly, the unsettling of Eurocentric knowledges, the questioning of dominant assumptions, and the diversification of modes and methods of knowledge production through the incorporation of everyday lived experiences, storytelling, narrative, and visual methods. Yeah, Colin, I'm sorry. What does that mean, and why are we doing the ways of knowing thing again? The alternative ways of knowing. That isn't that the hippie foo-foo stuff we've heard about before?
Yeah, all these papers are all about that other ways of knowing stuff. We heard that word salad that you just read. That's just sort of a lot of buzzwords, progressive buzzwords mixed with academic sounding things. We've seen this before. The other or alternative ways of knowing. What they really amount to in the end is treating indigenous peoples as kind of these omniscient oracles who can never be questioned about the statements that they make. It usually takes a lot of their folk stories that they've inherited through generations about nature, even things like their creation myths about their tribe, and it presents them as just being on equal footing with actual science and maybe DNA evidence of where their tribe
They're,
came from.
they're all just different ways of knowing, Colin.
Yes, all on the same exact footing. I was in when I was in college. I remember there was a video we had to watch in class called "Ghost in Your Genes." I think it was. It was genes as in genetics, which looked at like the genetic ancestry of some tribes, but the tribe had their own myths about where they came from. And so the scientists were sitting there and they were just having to just nod along, and they weren't allowed to push back against these people saying about how they came from the ground or something like that. And that's fine if you don't want to like mess with their creation myths and let them believe what they want to believe, but then to act like that's real science on par with like DNA evidence showing that you came from this certain strait when there's an ice bridge, these aren't the same thing. So these types of claims, they're not really just wrong, they don't have any place in actual science journals. The strength in science, as we've mentioned before, and we'll see again here, is this idea of universalism. So what's true is true. Anyone can identify and verify it for themselves. But if we're forced to take these sort of folk creation stories, these myths, as truth, then we come into this impossible conundrum, because we have so many indigenous societies, all with their own versions of their origin story, and they're often all contradictory. And so it's impossible to treat them all as equally valid and equally true at the same time.
Okay, well, let's get into the four themes of feminist glaciology. I see here the first one is knowledge producers. What does that refer to?
So this section kind of starts off fine, I guess, by stating basic historical facts about glaciology, how it was historically dominated by white men. This was the kind of the case for all of science, to be honest, at the time. But according to the authors, this produced what they call, quote, masculinist narratives about glacier knowledge production. And then,
Um,
yeah. And then to fix this sex imbalance, this problematic imbalance, the paper mentioned a program that was called Girls on Ice, and it was meant to get young women interested in glaciology. Yet the authors also then mentioned that they regret the fact that this program, quote, perpetuated a male-female
oh my
binary
gosh, of
that
course.
feminist
There.
studies and queer theory have long sought to eliminate. So yeah, the paper claims that women possess different knowledges about glaciers due to the fact that they've historically spent more time tending livestock near glaciers and managing aspects of agriculture that use glacier runoff.
It's all so strange. I love the woke versus woke stuff where they wanted to start the program to get girls interested in ice, but then they realized they're like invalidating they thems or something, so they have to flagellate themselves. It shows kind of the self-destructive and self-defeating contradictory narrative of a lot of this stuff. But I also can't get over this idea that like women have a unique way of knowing about glaciers because they have historically spent more time tending livestock near glaciers. I mean, Colin, is this knowledge supposedly transferred through the X chromosomes or something? Like, how does the fact that previous centuries ago women did something mean that a woman today would have more knowledge about something? Seems totally incoherent and absurd to me.
I mean, it's completely bizarre, totally bonkers. They don't go into detail on exactly how this knowledge gets transmitted. Uh, it's kind of like claiming that I might know more about the ecology of like natural water springs because I drink bottled spring water or something like that, or if I did it over enough time, or if my generations did, we would have this inherent knowledge about springs. In reality, these women, they don't possess different knowledge about glaciers. Their experience just reflects kind of this totally different, unscientific relationship with them. It's just they drink glacial runoff. So what? That doesn't give them knowledge about glaciers.
I don't know, this whole male female distinction feels kind of transphobic to me, Colin.
Well, not to worry too much there, because while the authors constantly compare and contrast like the roles of males and females in glaciology, she's always sure to remind us to avoid what she says, quote, clinging to a sharp male-female binary or portraying women as passive victims. The last part of this section discusses so-called knowledge disparities between men and women, as though this poses like a great problem to the field that must be fixed by what they call diversifying knowledge production.
So, how does one diversify knowledge production? Are we doing DEI for ICE now?
Well, they do this really by what amounts to simply just listening to Indigenous women's perspectives about ice. But while asking Indigenous communities and I think the people within them about their views on ice and glaciers, while it might be anthropologically interesting, we should never confuse their stories and folklore as legitimate contributions to the science of glaciology. Because any claim that they make, any claim that anybody makes, you actually have to test it using the scientific method at some point, which they dismiss as this Eurocentric way of knowing. So indigenous communities, they might possess knowledge about their environment, but you can't just say, because indigenous people said so. That's not a reliable way to know what's true.
Yeah, for sure, but I guess that this person disagrees. What is this second section? I imagine we're going to get into more of the same kind of woke pseudoscience, but in the second section titled Gendered Science and Knowledge, what is this all about?
So here the authors, they criticize how scientific results about glaciers have been, what they say, gendered in the past due to male dominance within the field. They criticize this, I'll use quotes here, strong tendency of men to, quote, classify, measure, map, and dominate and control non-human nature as if it were a noble and predictable machine, rather than dynamic, chaotic, unpredictable, and coupled natural human systems.
Yes. How dare those men classify, measure, and map things? That sounds like really horrible thing for scientists to do. Also, like unintentionally offensive. Again, as if women can't also classify and measure things. What is even going on? My head is spinning.
Yeah, I mean, how dare they do basic science, basically, which assumes the world is knowable and has certain rules, which I would say is justified based on science's track record of discovering these types of rules and these patterns. Um, as you mentioned too, yeah, it's like the women have this other way that like measuring is somehow inherently masculine, and women shouldn't be measuring things. Um, you know, Learning about the world just involves things like classifying things. If you want to separate things out of like periodic table or something, you need to measure things. You need to map the physical world. You can't just sit in your room and ponder things forever. You need to go out in the world and actually measure things. Okay, this should be neither surprising nor alarming for anyone who knows anything about science.
I don't know. Sounds pretty horrifying and gendered and deeply sexist and patriarchal to me. What else do they get into in this section?
They criticize what they call, quote, gendered aspects of cryospheric knowledge, and by that they just mean glaciers around the world. The example they give is how early male naturalists reported on, quote, how they overcame savage environments and bitter cold conditions, frequently celebrated their selfless, heroic risk-taking. So the fact that these men, upon their return, were described in the newspapers and stuff as not just selfless seekers of truth, but tough adventurers. So they say the fact that these men, upon return, were described as, quote, not just selfless seekers of truth, but tough adventurers, is apparently bad because this portrayal of, quote, male triumph over hostile nature and isolated space in the name of science fed nationalism and colonialism.
No, they did not just say, well, hold on. These people kind of were heroic adventurers, right? They were going out to
Yes.
like explore and measure icebergs. So heralding them doesn't seem as that doesn't seem bad. And then she did not seriously just blame them doing research and being praised for the kind of adventurous nature of it for nationalism and colonialism. Goodness.
I mean, it is totally heroic what these people did. So these sections, they go on and on about the problems with these sort of masculine and heroic tendencies in science generally, and then, about glaciers specifically. But these were extremely tough conditions back then, and it's not really surprising that you'd get these really like rugged men who tended to be the ones to go out there and explore these uncharted, very dangerous, icy terrain. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, really. The authors also claim that this, quote, sustained masculinist atmosphere pushed out, quote, alternative knowledges and practices that restricted the scientific questions asked, practitioners evolved, methods employed, sites studied, and results achieved.
Wait, why is that bad? To restrict the methods you're using in science? Presumably that should be restricted.
Yes, exactly. Right on the head. It's not a problem. For science to work, it must follow some sort of restricted method. It's a very strict method. It's not just anything goes. It excludes a lot of potential noise that could be making your results unreliable. Indigenous people, they don't inherently have some special scientific knowledge about glaciers. So they shouldn't be dictating the scientific questions being asked and the methodology. That's, again, as I mentioned, not to say that we can't gain any information about glaciers that might be of interest to science from indigenous populations. Maybe they know about a strange ice formation over here or there that might be scientifically interesting, but they don't have this special knowledge just because of their indigenous status of who they are.
No, Colin, you just don't get it. We can just call up Senator Elizabeth Warren because she's got the double
Yeah.
whammy of woman and Native American, so she knows all the knowledge and all the different ways of knowing. Well, wait, actually, never mind about that second part. But no, in all seriousness, like this feels extremely fetishizing to Native American people and Indigenous people, like almost in a way that's like stereotypical and a trope and not actually particularly progressive. But let's get into this next part. What the heck does this mean when it talks about systems of scientific domination?
This section, it starts out criticizing the fact that glaciology is generally performed by people in wealthy and developed countries. They think this is an inherent problem of the field, that European and North American scientists conduct most of the global climate simulations without much representation from these indigenous communities.
This is just like they love to problematize things that are just obviously true and how things work. Obviously, second and third world countries where people are worried about where their next meal is going to come from or how they're going to clothe their kids are not going to prioritize studying ice. I don't understand how that's bad or anything other than inevitable.
Yeah, it's not bad at all. I mean, this critique that they brought up about how the climate models are generally run by Europeans and North Americans, this just completely violates that principle of universality that I talked about. It doesn't matter who's running the climate simulations. You just bring in some tribal leader to run the simulations. this doesn't add anything to it. So skin color or anything, again, doesn't give you any special insight about what to include or not include in the models. And it would be odd to see like the types of things that some of these tribal people would want to include, because they would have to be justified on their own grounds too. But according to the authors, this underrepresentation of indigenous glaciologists means that what they say is knowledge production is inherently flawed because, quote, it is restricted to a group of scientists who often cannot be divorced from larger processes of colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and capitalist resource extraction.
Oh my gosh. They just have to bring up every woke buzzword imaginable and connect it to the study of ice.
Yes, that's what they tend to do. It's just buzzword after buzzword. This is really just kind of a useless type of criticism, I think. These are, again, these throwaway words that are a stand-in for any sort of rigorous critique. If there's a basis for how actual knowledge is produced, then just explain what it is in simple terms. Measure it, devise an experiment to correct for the bias. Simply diversifying knowledge production, this is meaningless and serves, I think, more of just like this form of political signaling than a valid scientific critique.
I mean, anyway, do they even get specific about what kinds of alternative knowledge they think are so valid from indigenous people, or is it just hand waving, or do they actually get specific?
Yes, because here we've just been hearing about like the need for indigenous representation, but what does that actually look like, So the authors give an example of what they call these alternative visions of ice, where instead of trying to, quote, measure glaciers and understand ice physics by studying glacial ice itself, indigenous accounts do not portray the ice as passive, but to be measured and mastered in a stereotypically masculinist sense. So now things are going to get really weird. Okay.
Wait, you're telling me things aren't weird yet, Colin?
I mean, things have been kind of par for the course for most of like the woke science studies, but I mean, just listen to this. They say, quote, the glaciers these women speak of engage all the senses. The glaciers are willful, capricious, easily excited by human intemperance, but equally placated by quick-witted human responses. Proper behavior is deferential.
Are they suggesting that like glaciers, massive hunks of ice, have feelings?
More than just feelings. So Western researchers, to them, are, and this is, we're quoting directly from the piece here, are, quote, warned about firm taboos against cooking with grease near glaciers that are offended by such smells because cooked food, especially fat, might grow into a glacier overnight if improperly handled.
Sorry, what? I mean, that's obviously just not true. So it's almost like this person is trying to discredit the validity of the indigenous ways of knowing by explaining to us what that would look like and how absurd it would be to place that on an equivalent level to science.
Yeah, I mean, in the paper, the authors also explain when they tried to like corner some well-known glaciologist about whether or not like some of the phenomena they were looking at could be a reflection of just because the glaciers were afraid or they didn't like the smell of grease, and it shows how like he was just really dismissive and walked away, and it's just like, yeah, he probably just thought you guys were completely bonkers. So the authors of this paper, they kind of lament the fact that such knowledge often meets resistance. So such knowledge of grease-phobic glaciers, because they say, quote, folk glaciologists challenge existing power dynamics and cultures of control within glaciology. Now, hear me out, Brad. Maybe it's just because the notion that glaciers get offended by the smell of cooking oil is just totally bonkers.
I'm kind of stunned.
Yeah. I hadn't actually seen that part the first time in 2016 when I first read the paper. I don't know how that got by the people that were originally talking about us. So the authors in this paper, they also criticize what they call archetypal masculinist projects of ice core drilling. And then they portray this in pretty overtly sexual terms as literally penetrating glaciers.
Oh my gosh. Why do they have to sexualize everything? This woke stuff always seems to come back to some sort of like under expressed kink or fetish at some point.
Yeah, we've seen this with the brine ship, with the queering babies, probably the other ones too. They always kind of loop back to this sexualization aspect, which unfortunately there's more of that in this paper. So I think we should move on to this last section here.
God, I'm really not sure how much more of this I can take, but what is alternative representation? This final section of the paper. What is this all about?
So this section is all about the amazingness of indigenous knowledge and disparaging real science as merely what they call dominant Western assumptions, narratives, and representations which tend to privilege the natural sciences as opposed to the supernatural ones, I suppose, and often emerge through this the co-constituted process of colonialism, patriarchy, and unequal power relations that, they say, erase local, regional, and even variation in the diversity of perspectives, including those of women and other marginalized groups. But I think it's important to note here that science is supposed to limit diversity of perspectives by performing experiments that prove something is actually wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that seems kind of inherent to the whole project of science. But again, I have to come back to this that, like, it really seems that this thinking fetishizes indigenous people or, like, views them as somehow, like, special geniuses with unique insights just by virtue of their genetics or their heritage or what have you. And you see that kind of thinking a lot with woke stuff, but every time I'm always struck by how actually reductionist and essentialist it is.
Yeah, there is this fetishization that often occurs here. So it's important to keep in mind too that this obsession with these diverse perspectives in traditional cultures, it only really applies to these like sacred indigenous populations. It's not even a noble savage vibe. It's just straight up noble savage. I doubt they'd be interested, and we know that they're not, in sort of the Christian folk knowledge like Noah's Ark for explaining Earth's biodiversity or Genesis for how people came along. But if it's an indigenous myth that is similarly supernatural, it just gets a pass. And not just a pass, it gets promoted as on par with actual scientific knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, you pointed this out next, that the authors criticize aerial top-down images of glaciers as a conquering gaze and reminiscent of detached, voyeuristic, pornographic images. Again, we come back to the absurd connection to, like, woke buzzwords, and again, we're sexualizing the ice.
It's unavoidable. We always get back to sexualizing inanimate objects in these papers. In the brine shrimp paper, the feminists made love to Utah's Great Salt Lake. And so, really, like, sex with glaciers, it's just like nothing now. It doesn't even faze me. It's just like, why not glaciers? So the authors, they describe a 2001 book called To Drink a Glacier, where the authors, quote, interpret her experience with Alaska's Mendenhall Glacier as sexual and intimate. And Brad, I think I'm going to need you to read this for us.
Oh, God. That drink is like a kiss that takes in the entire body of the other, like some wondrous, omnipotent liquid tongue touching our own tongues all over the roofs and sides of our mouths, then moving in us and through to where it knows. I swallow, trying to make the spiritual, sexual sweetness of it last. That was about ice.
Okay, that's the end of the paper. I think we need to
Thank God.
we just need to abandon ship right there. So if that hasn't disturbed you enough, you'll be saddened to know that this research was supported by a National Science Foundation grant. So yes, your tax dollars were hard at work here.
Oh my gosh, that is so demoralizing that we're funding this. But I can't say I'm particularly surprised to learn of this kind of thing at this point. Okay, guys, let us know what you think of that wild paper sexualizing ice and somehow making glaciology about feminism, because it is an infamous one in this series of woke papers that we wanted to go through and we had to suffer through, so you do as well. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you for our subscribers who are signing up as premium supporters of the podcast. Regardless, remember to recommend the show to a friend. That's the number one way that podcasts grow. Hit that like button, comment with your thoughts, yada, yada, yada. And we'll talk again and be back with more insanity next week.